Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. Today was day 34 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings, and it featured two witnesses, Lia Scanlan and Staff Sergeant Addie MacCallum. In the morning session, it was Lia Scanlan, who was the Civilian Director of Strategic Communications for the RCMP in Nova Scotia, and her role was mainly centered around the issuing of tweets and Facebook posts, but tweets followed by Facebook posts during the morning of April 19th, 2020. And Staff Sergeant McCallum was called in almost immediately as soon as events were unfolding, about quarter to 11 p.m. on the 18th, and he was involved throughout the night in a supporting supervisory role. Staff Sergeant McCallum was the supporting staff sergeant for 6 detachments at the time, so felt that he should become involved in events as they started to unfold and became aware of them. So some interesting things. Both the witnesses became emotional at times for somewhat different reasons. I saw Lia Scanlan was the subject of some news articles over the past few days because her statements to the Mass Casualty Commission had been released, and in those statements she was quite firm about how everything was done properly and she wouldn't change a thing. And she was being criticized in the media and social media, I think appropriately, for having said so. She was a little more contrite and withdrawn, I think, today on the stand, and that's not an unusual thing. I mean, when you give a statement, you're in a room with basically one or two other people, and things are coming at you, and you're not thinking this is a statement that's going to be broadcast publicly, or that everyone's going to be dissecting in days to come, or that the whole thing is going to be posted. Maybe excerpts of it will be used or whatever. So it's not unusual for people to take a different tone when they're given a statement as to when they're giving testimony, but I suspect in the Miss Scanlan's case, being in the communications world, it was partly also a reaction to the negative news coverage over the past couple of days that sort of prompted her change in attitude or tone today on the stand. Substantively, Miss Scanlan was a real she was a promoter of the use of social media as opposed to the traditional forms of sending out releases to all the media outlets as a way to do that more quickly and in response to critical incidents, or just generally as a communications tool for the RCMP. And in fact, after the Moncton RCMP shooting incidents with Justin Bork back in 2015, she was part author of the McNeil Report sections that dealt with communications. And two of the things that came out of that was, one was a sort of a push to use social media and Twitter in these incidents, and then the other was to give communications people some relief, just the same as other people involved in a critical incident response. So, interestingly, ironically, troublingly, Miss Scanlan is not a user of Twitter herself, though this was the primary means used to communicate. And it had some real impacts too, because during the usage of Twitter, there was inconsistent use of hashtags. She didn't use a thread. The language, there were basic problems with the content and the timeliness of the tweets. But just in addition to that, she didn't seem to really understand Twitter herself, and use something like, I don't use TikTok or Snapchat. I don't understand those things very well or how to use them. But I know Twitter. She was, talking about hitting send. Well, you kind of do, but you tweet it out. Little things like that if you were an actual Twitter user, you may better understand. The use of threads, the consistent use of hashtags, those sorts of things. So that was a sort of interesting that the promoter of this isn't a user in her day-to-day life. Yes, like I say, she was emotional at times, but it seemed to be in reaction to the criticism that she's been experiencing, because she said she substantively sticks with what she said in her statements about how things she thought were done properly. Twitter, social media is what is used now, as opposed to emergency alerts, which she didn't really talk about very much. So another thing that came out of that is that there was no formal policy for the issuing who was supposed to issue tweets. We heard yesterday from Corporal Jennifer Clark, retired Corporal Jennifer Clark, that she thought she needed to get approval from her boss, Lia Scanlan, to issue a tweet, and waited this half hour for that approval and was, up and down the line. Well, we hear from Lia Scanlan today, actually, she wasn't surprised that Corporal Clark sought that approval, but in fact, there was no formal approval process for sending out tweets. Ms. Scanlan's view, it would be her that would approve it, or the critical incident commander. If there isn't a critical incident commander, then the risk manager. So a senior staff sergeant in charge of that situation, rather than, say, a corporal, a constable, somebody that's on the ground seeing things unfold in front of them. So that was an interesting thing, but perhaps just as troubling, is that there is still no policy. Ms. Scanlan said that's being worked on right now. Well, geez. If you have a major incident like this, where this usage of social media seemed to be a source of delay and problem, and just the whole concept of using it as opposed to emergency alert as an issue, you would think you'd develop some policies on that and look at that a little more closely in the immediate aftermath, certainly within 2 years. So that seems to be an issue with the RCMP and with their public communications policies in particular. So that was Lia Scanlan's testimony. The afternoon was with Staff Sergeant Addie MacCallum. Staff Sergeant McCallum is actually still testifying. He's being cross-examined now. I'm recording this around 5 p.m. Just to mention again, planning the timeliness of a day, having 2 witnesses isn't insurmountable, but, when Commission Counsel uses up all the time to ask questions and leaves no time for cross-examination within the normal confines of a court day, that usually ends at 4:30 or 5 at the latest, then you end up with these issues. There's nothing that happens from now on during the day is going to get news coverage, and I just have some commitments where I have to get to, so I can't wait. I'll watch it later. If anything major happens during his cross-examination, I'll report that back. I kind of doubt that there'll be any major revelations. Staff Sergeant McCallum was quite open about where he saw failings, issues, delays, any of these problems. He wasn't trying to hide anything. He was very forthright, I thought, in his testimony. He strikes me, and I know Staff Sergeant McCallum a little bit. He was posted in Guysborough. He was very well regarded when he was here. He was seen as a real good leader within the force. He was involved in the Desmond inquiry. He was involved in the investigation after the Desmond family tragedy, which led into the Desmond inquiry. And he testified at the inquiry. I mean, at that time, he went above and beyond, extended his shift until, he couldn't go on any further, and made sure that his officers were well looked after, was communicative with the family and community members, and just did a very good job there. I think my impression in this situation is that the older staff sergeants were sort of, maybe giving him, Staff Sergeant McCallum, additional tasks to do. Some would say what's called the curse of the competent. When you're doing well at something, then you're given more responsibility. So, yeah, he was involved in some of the early events, but he wasn't a commander making command decisions, but rather in a supportive role as a staff sergeant that covered 6 detachments, felt that he should be involved. He was communicating with people as he found out information early on. He was asked about the emergency alert, and his response was that he thought that efforts were underway to call people in the community to, get them out of there, as he says has happened many times in his experience on other files. So didn't see that as a major issue at the time, and wasn't really aware of alert ready. He one of the first things he had to do, and we heard this evidence from Staff Sergeant Halliday, was check to see, because the information was that there was a police vehicle, that whether one of the officers, their own RCMP officers, had gone rogue. So that was one thing he looked into. Then he traveled into the Bible Hill detachment, where he ran into all of these technology issues. Some of the systems where you would normally go, an RCMP officer would go to find out information on individuals. The mapping system, pictometry, wasn't working. They went through, he said, 5 or 6 different, computer stations there at the detachment, and things weren't working at all. He did have a chance later on to, he said that I think the next night in a debrief with Major Crimes, to get a look at the pictometry printout, and it was only a black and white printout. Pictometry has color capabilities. He said when he sees this, he sees the Blueberry Road, and he said, there was obviously something there. The mapping they were working with didn't show it, but had they had pictometry, he would have noticed it, he said, immediately, because he saw it immediately once he saw the pictometry printout, and that would have changed their containment efforts. So he was involved in some containment efforts and some evaluation of this. He said around 3:30, after some explosions, 3:30 in the morning, some explosions were heard in Portapique itself, and they reviewed the containment efforts, not because they thought any vehicle might emerge. They still weren't aware of the Blueberry Road, but thinking more of the western side towards the water, the river, where he thought maybe somebody would be able to escape on foot. So they looked into those issues at that time. It was also just soon after that when the original IR team, Basselt, Merchant, and Patton, came out and were briefed with the 3 staff sergeants, McCallum, Halliday, and I'm not sure if it was Rehill or one of the other staff sergeants, but they were talking to them, and at that time, Constable Patton showed them the bullet that he recovered from Andrew MacDonald, who was also personally known to Staff Sergeant McCallum as he was to Constable Basselt, and that was the first time that McCallum had heard about the shooting of Andrew MacDonald and that evidence that emerged from that early on encounter. So that was unfortunate that the IR team was sort of stuck in Portapique so long and there wasn't an opportunity to communicate that. Staff Sergeant McCallum doesn't know why that information didn't get up the line to their level where decisions were being made. The most, troubling, important, maybe part of Staff Sergeant McCallum's evidence actually, though, was later when he was at the command center for quite some time. He testified about how he was trying to distribute the photo of the vehicle once he got it, and was sending it out to everybody that he could. Though he wasn't involved in the decision to whether to issue tweets or public communications, that was at Steve Halliday's level and Lia Scanlan's level, and he knew that Staff Sergeant McCallum knew that discussions were taking place because he was tasked with, distributing it to other people as a result of some other discussions. So he kind of, that was a little above his decision-making level. But at one point he got in the vehicle with Craig Hubley, Constable Hubley, who ended up being the person that shot Gabriel Wortman dead at the Big Stop. At the time, Constable Hubley, the dog handler, was going up towards the Glenholm area, up Highway 4, when they got word that the killer was at the Fisher's house. Now, McCallum knew this residence. He hadn't been there, but he had traveled up there enough that he knew exactly where it was going. And he testified about how everybody was going in this direction, but stopped like 2 kilometers short of the residence and just sort of staged there. And he arrives and he's like, what is going on? Why are we sitting here? Let's go. And he was eager to keep going. And he said even just that couple of minutes, of course, he finds out after the fact that could have made all the difference. He said if he had to stop for a moment. He was having a really hard time and got quite emotional thinking back to this. Sounds like something that really haunted him today. It was kind of tough to watch, frankly. That if he had just what are we doing? Keep going. If he had kept going at that moment, maybe he would have seen the killer taking off north on Highway 4 and pursued, and things would have been different. So that really troubles him to this day. And so anyway, he talked about that. So that was Staff Sergeant McCallum's testimony. It was powerful. I thought he behaved competently given the information that he had, which was insufficient. the technology that he had available to him was insufficient, things that weren't his fault but certainly affected his ability to do his job. So that was significant evidence today. We're going to hear more evidence tomorrow from a panel on public communications and the radio tower system in Nova Scotia as well, and how the technology capabilities of that, which seems to be some issues. Just previewing some of that, I know that one of the issues that came up in the emergency alert discussion was the surprise from Michael Hallows, the Australian expert, that our system is privately owned in Canada. Well, guess what? The radio system in Nova Scotia is privately owned as well by Bell, and so we'll see tomorrow how Bell explains the limited capabilities that the system has, which I'm aware of. So I'll be watching that closely tomorrow. I hope you'll join me for my reflections after that. But until then, that was day 34 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings. So thank you for listening, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.